a lot of the activism and advocacy I've been involved in is this kind of mixture of like there is no choice in it. Like we have no choice but to persevere and persevere in the face of such extreme and high rates of violence, but also persevere in the face of governments and funders who seek to erase and silence us.
Dr. Chay Brown knows there is a time and place to be outraged by the outrageous. After working across the globe, she returned to her rural Australian home to bring a voice to those who are silenced by violence and light to the systems that shadow victims. This episode of Remarkable Women, Powerful Stories, hosted by Lynn Foley, contains details of gender-based violence. Please take care when listening to Chay's journey.
Who's Dr. Chay Brown is probably something that I am still working out, maybe. But I'm born and raised in Mparntwe, Alice Springs. Mparntwe is the Aranda name, the traditional or real name for this place, Alice Springs, which is in Central Australia. And I was raised west of Alice Springs in the bush, as we call it. So I lived very remotely growing up. In a very small place of around 100 people, most of whom were my immediate and direct family members, as well as was brought up in lots of remote Aboriginal communities. My family worked in those communities, and so I spent a significant portion of my childhood in communities. And spent a lot of my time, outside, living in the bush, growing up. When I was about 14 or 15, my childhood had always been quite turbulent, and I'd always been surrounded by violence my whole life. That escalated and increased to a point where my mother had to flee, had to leave. She just disappeared one day. And the fallout from that was huge and had a huge impact on me. But at the time, I was quite angry with her for leaving us. Once we knew that she was safe and that she was okay, we had concerns that she'd ended her own life, but she was okay. She was safe. I was then, mad at her for leaving us out there, leaving us where, we weren't safe. We didn't feel safe and it was not safe. But as I've kind of grown up and gotten older, I realised that she did what she had to do. And obviously now working in this space, I've since kind of risk assessed what was going on. Just from what I could see from my point of view as a child, I can see that it was a very, very high risk situation, and she did what she needed to survive. My mother has several disabilities, and that's because she has Usher syndrome. So what that means is that from birth, she has vision and hearing loss, quite extensive vision and hearing loss. You can see it from about, maybe retains about 2% of her vision, and it's all in holes, and retains maybe about 20% of her hearing. So I watched the ways that her disabilities were used against her, and how that often meant that the violence that she experienced manifested in very particular ways, in unique ways. And then what it also meant is that when I later came to leave my family home out bush because I experienced a family violence related assault and resulting head trauma, for which I was hospitalised for. So I've got a big scar that runs down the back of my head. So when it came time to front up to the courts about who would be responsible for me and who would take care of me and who would take care of my younger brothers, her disabilities were often used against her and were the reason that she was told, and that we were told, that she couldn't take care of us, that she was somehow not capable of taking care of us. So I've experienced what it is to be a child in those systems, systems that are tasked to take care of us and keep us safe. I know what it's like to call the police for a domestic family violence related incident. I know what it's like to be responded to by the police in not a great way, which is certainly what happened when I was assaulted. I should say that was kind of the last time I was assaulted. It was just the one that resulted in the hospitalization. And there'd been many, many, many times before that. So I know what that's like. And as lots of victim survivors do, they know those systems really intimately, which I think is why it's really important to center them in our conversations around ending gender-based violence, because they know the flaws in all those systems. They know the weaknesses. Equally, they know the
Yes.
strengths, and they know, what should be shaping our response. As a result of those kind of early experiences, and unfortunately a lot of those experiences continued right up until I'd say like my early 20s, from my family dynamic, but then also with partners and dating violence, and when I went on to learn more about gender-based violence, I could really see those patterns and the cyclical nature of that violence in my own life. I felt that I had to come to this work around ending gender-based violence, which is what I do. All of the work that I do is in preventing domestic family sexual violence. Not really because I chose to, but because like that was kind of where I had to go. That's what I had to do, to be a part of trying to change this for other people. And so now all of the work that I do is in prevention and response to domestic family sexual violence here in Central Australia and the Northern Territory. And I see myself as being part of national and global movements to do the same. I came into this work through kind of a research avenue, doing my master's looking at the impact of the Northern Territory emergency response on violence against women in Alice Springs town camps, and then through my PhD looking at what works to prevent violence against women in the Northern Territory, and now work in this space, designing programs, delivering programs, working with women experiencing violence, working with children experiencing violence, and working with men who are using violence. So I don't know if I've answered about who I am or really just what I do.
I think, Shay, you've answered somewhat both of those, and it's really important to hear how where you grew up and what's happened to you. I know you said to me previously it was like you had no choice but to go into gender-based violence in the end. But between your early years and now, I know that you had a range of amazing experiences through your education pathway, and you mentioned a couple of them just now. You've got your PhD these days, but you worked overseas in different internships supporting vulnerable women through their challenges. Can you share some of the key touch points from, I guess, when you started your education through that work that has now brought you to your PhD and the work you do back in your community?
Yeah. I went off to university, and I was the first person in my family to finish high school, and then was the first person in my family to go to university. And I was always kind of strongly drawn to matters of social justice, and I think it's because I felt in the injustice that we'd experienced, my mother, my siblings, and I felt that really keenly. So I was always drawn to matters of social justice, and I really wanted to work in human rights, and I really wanted to work helping other people. So I went off to university and just had a massive culture shock, because that required, traveling whatever it is, 3,000 kilometers away, and went initially to university in Melbourne and didn't do well. Really hated it. Really,
Yeah.
really was a very, very different version of Australia than what I had grown up in. Um, I found it really shocking. I didn't fit. I found it really difficult to relate to other people. I found it really, really hard. But nevertheless, was doing my studies and started matters of gender-based violence started appearing more and more. And up until this point, I really didn't have the language to frame my experiences or to understand them. I knew that they weren't good. I felt kind of deeply I was angry about them, but also quite ashamed as well, and still had this thing lingering where it's not something that we can talk about and it's not something that we can share. And so through my studies, as I kind of started learning more and more about gender-based violence, even about gender, to be honest, it was like a light going on, a light switch going on. And then all of a sudden I could see it everywhere. And it was healing in a way. because it makes you realize that it's not just you, that you're not on your own, that you're not the only person that this happens to, and that this is a bigger and broader problem, that it's not the fault, the deficit isn't in you or isn't in your family, that this is a cultural, broader cultural problem, a global problem. And there's some solidarity in that. There's some connection in that. So after that, I wanted to go more and more into that field. So I had a bit of time working in Uganda, and then a bit of time working in Thailand as well, working with women who had been trafficked. All of that work just kept reminding me that where I needed to work and what I needed to do was in my own community, and in my own, where I'm from, my own home. So that's what drew me back. I kind of went away, learned a lot. That light bulb came on, and then I had to circle back and I had to come home, because particularly, from people from high income countries, and particularly white people as well, like there's that real danger of white saviorism and going off to save other people, and there's plenty of at home that needs to be worked on, and plenty of problems, and people don't need saving. And I know how frustrated we get when people come here wanting to save us, and there's no need for saviors here. We've got plenty of solutions. We just need support. So it brought me back home to do that work here. But that was also very confronting, when you start working and looking and examining your own community and where you're from, and researching with people where you're from. That's really hard. It can be quite traumatic. It certainly was for me in those early days. Because you're forced to question a lot of things that you just kind of took verbatim growing up. And also because it's very difficult to distance yourself. There's no, which I don't agree with anyway, but there's none of this kind of scientific objectivity when you're researching your own home. The heart is in it. Yeah.
And your PhD research, I think, if I remember rightly, in particular or your masters, were both around Alice Springs and the town camps and all of the issues there, which of course lend themselves to that saviorism that you speak about, that people coming in wanting to change and be saviors. And I know from what you've told me previously that the drawback to gender-based violence felt like there was no option, but it was a good option. And that grew out of family law court, your time in coronial inquiries, and experiencing firsthand the results of gender-based violence at home in Alice Springs. Can you please share any of those and your views on the current situation and why we find ourselves with this ever-increasing issue of violence against women and children within, of course, your own community in the centre of Australia, but elsewhere? Because it's there and it's talked about, and it's talked about differently, I think, in different communities.
So I first came to look at this in a research capacity through my master's. So I was looking at the impact of the Northern Territory emergency response, or otherwise known as the intervention on violence against women on Alice Springs town camps specifically. So town camps are small Aboriginal communities that sit on the social and geographical fringes of Alice Springs in Central Australia. And they're markedly different from the surrounding suburbs, both in terms of infrastructure, house build, access, disadvantage, all of those things, but are also places of incredible strength and resilience and language and culture. But they sit in this kind of jurisdictional limbo where no one really knows what to do with them or how to support them, and governments haven't been particularly interested in supporting them. In fact, they've tried to erase them many, many, many times over, but town camps have kind of stood steadfast and resilient in the face of all of that. In the face of ongoing colonisation. So that intervention that was rolled out in 2007 by the Australian government, where they literally rolled the military into Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory to impose measures. And these measures were in response to allegations of child sexual abuse. So these measures were supposedly going to create safety, but none of them seemed to actually be directed at safety, and none of them seemed to be focused on violence against women. There were things like mandatory income management, the enforcement of alcohol prohibition and pornography prohibition, lots of things like that. So through that work, I saw that really top-down, punitive approach, really poorly designed, and no consultation, not bringing communities along at all. And yeah, of course, it didn't work. And of course, it created a lot of harm and a lot of damage, and that damage endures. But it was really hard doing that research because these were people I knew, and people I loved, and I just spent 2 years crying over my laptop doing that, and I thought, I'm just going to walk away from this, but then a few more women were killed in town camps, and so I decided to do my PhD, but I thought this time I'm really going to focus on solutions. And my PhD was very solutions focused, which allowed me to kind of get through it, which focused on, what works here in the NT. And I found that really, really beautiful process, and they work with these fantastic people all over the Northern Territory who, in spite of these high rates, do this amazing work every single day, because the Northern Territory has the highest rates of domestic family sexual violence in Australia, and amongst the highest rates in the world. So it has around 3 times the national average of domestic violence related assaults and 7 times the national average of intimate partner related homicides. Really, it is shocking what is allowed to happen in the Northern Territory without a blink of the eye, from the rest of the country, to be quite frank. And then I personally have known 3 women killed by their intimate partners. And in 2021, one of the women I'd been working with on my PhD, she was killed by her partner, in quite a graphic and horrific and public way, very public. And I remember learning about her death and seeing absolutely no news reports, no one saying anything. And she was quite a prominent woman. She was the president of her town camp. She'd been advocating against family violence for a long time. She'd met with ministers and special rapporteurs and all sorts, and her death was completely ignored because she was an Aboriginal woman. And that was crushing. That was so painful. It's painful to have someone you care about be killed, obviously, and ripped from your life really violently. And then painful to see the impact that has on their children and the entire community. But then there's another type of pain that happens when you see their life erased through silence. And that was incredibly difficult to deal with. And so the way that we responded to that was through, rallies and trying to make attention, and through movement building here in Central Australia and across the Northern Territory. Her death was examined in a coronial inquest, which ended up being the largest and longest running inquest into domestic violence deaths in Australian history.
Yeah.
And that process was really important, but really, really hard. Like, the depths of grief and trauma were really difficult. And I myself was called to give evidence several times. And that it was a hard process, cathartic in many ways. But again, to see that the deaths of those women who were examined in that process not capture the national attention in the ways that other women's deaths do in this country. But those are usually, white women, in urban centres of Australia. And it's right that their deaths are responded to in that way, but everyone deserves that. Aboriginal women deserve that. And we know that Aboriginal women are 32 times more likely to be hospitalised due to family violence assault in this country than non-Indigenous women are. And yet we are not centering Aboriginal women in our responses to this at all. A lot of the activism and advocacy I've been involved in is this kind of mixture of there is no choice in it. We have no choice but to persevere, and persevere in the face of such extreme and high rates of violence, but also persevere in the face of governments and funders who seek to erase and silence us, who don't seem to care what is happening here. And I say that because it is very much a choice what is happening here. There is one version of Australia, which is this very rich, wealthy country, but there is another version of Australia, which is what happens in remote places here, and what happens to Aboriginal people here in Central Australia and the Northern Territory, which is this systemic underfunding and unresourcing of their communities, the over-policing and under-policing of Aboriginal women and their bodies, and then the absolute silence in response to the violence that occurs against them and in the face of their deaths. I think the one question is like, is gender-based violence increasing? I'm not sure that it is nationally. It may be that our reporting mechanisms are getting a little bit better. But certainly what we can see here in the Northern Territory specifically is that assaults are going up, and that deaths of Aboriginal women are increasing here in the NT. And yet the mechanism and the response to try and change that is totally lacking here. We have communities that don't have internet, that don't have running water, that don't have sealed roads. And this is happening in the 9th richest country in the world. It's absolutely disgusting. And yet that's not a part of the conversation anywhere. And where I find it most disappointing is that even in our national movements to end gender-based violence, which, Central Australian women and Aboriginal women show up to again and again and again, not just show up, but lead, take charge, out the front. But that broader movement also ignores what's happening here. And I think that it's fair and reasonable and just that if violence against women is so much higher here in the NT, which it is, then the Northern Territory, that experience should be centred. It should be centred in all movement building, in all organising, and it should be centred in the national response to end violence against women. But it's not. And there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that exists in this space, the things that we could be doing right now that would make a difference to Aboriginal women in the Northern Territory.
So how much of it then falls back to, you've talked a lot about solutions and solution-based, and then the communication that's needed, and that two-way, the listening and the hearing that goes with listening, and then that communication backwards and forwards, because a lot of women, Aboriginal women, older women, regardless of culture, and then women of other cultures often feel invisible, and then the next step from invisible is erased. So it's a bit of a messy question I'm putting to you here, but what's the place then of the communication in this, within communities, between Aboriginal women and other women, and then, as you say, the funders and the responders and government in this?
Yeah. Look, I think that kind of question just shows the importance of an intersectional approach. And we've known that for a really long time about the ways that violence can manifest differently and disproportionately impact people because of those systems of power and oppression. So I think that what we need is we need to center those experiences in all of our responses. There's a theory which is called maximal objectivity, which is this idea that if you look at somebody who experiences the most marginalization, or historical marginalization, and if you work with them and center them in the response and design something that works for them and is led by them, then it will work for everybody else. So if we can work with Aboriginal communities, and Aboriginal women can lead these responses to design things to end gender-based violence, if it works for them, it will work for everybody else. If we can design something that works in remote places for Aboriginal women in those remote places, it will also work in city centres, and it will it will also work for non-Indigenous women as well. So I don't think it needs to be that complicated. I think we need to flip things on its head. And again, that's a conversation we've been having for a very long time about, top-down approaches versus community-driven approaches. So I think we need to spend a great deal of time listening to those communities, and not just listening, but actually hearing what is said, and then acting. And I think the importance of having some of the attention is that often attention that comes around those movements and media attention and whatnot is that often it's a catalyst for change, and it drives things forward. And so that, I think, is why we do need that attention. We do need that centering within movement building, and people being willing to listen and to hear. And that might mean changing your approach, and it often means learning when it's not your time to speak, which is hard, and it's something that I'm still learning and have to learn many times over. But sometimes it's not your turn to speak, and you can give up the microphone, and you can give it up to someone who historically has not had access to that microphone, because their perspective is really important. And if we want to be if we want to be effective about this, then in feminist organizing, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to address those power imbalances. And there is no shortage of solutions. We know what the solutions are. We don't need people to save us. But what we do need is a radical reimagining and transformation of systems here, and the way that we have been approaching gender-based violence at the moment has been through that really top-down approach. We need to flip it on its head.
Yeah. So if I come back to the voice and who has the microphone and the whole place of voice, I've got two places that perhaps you'd like to explore. The first one is, how challenging is it to have gained your voice and have it and use it and decide when to use it? And you've touched on that a bit. And the second one is there a place for outrage? And if there is a place for outrage, when is that place to get those positive outcomes and solutions? So challenges for you, and then that managing the outrage and the place of.
Yeah. Look, I think when it comes to my own voice, I think I experienced for a very long time what it's like to be silenced and to be told that you're not allowed to speak, and that you're not allowed to have your own thoughts, and you're not allowed to have your own opinion. I experienced that my entire childhood. So that has just made me more determined to use my voice and to speak up. And that doesn't mean that doesn't come with challenges. Of course it does. And I've experienced all of those things about, being often a young woman, not so much anymore, but often being a young woman in those spaces. But I think that there was never an alternative, because you wouldn't want to go back to being silenced. But it is challenging. It is challenging trying to push your way often into spaces where nobody wants you, and that you're the irritating one. You're like the noisy cricket, and it does feel like, I said this to you before, it does feel like I'm shouting into a void a lot of the time. And I do think sometimes I have that reputation of just being like that angry angry woman.
The angry
But,
ant, the angry ant in the place. But it's also about it comes back down to what does it come back down to when you choose to use that, and when you choose to be outraged, and when you choose to be solutions focused over a topic that's so much ingrained in your heart.
Yeah, look, and I don't think there's a binary. Like, I think that outrage has its place. I think we can use it strategically, because what is happening is outrageous. What's happening here would never be accepted and tolerated in the streets of Melbourne and Sydney. But I'm also cautious about that outrage, because you don't want to push it to the point where we get another top-down intervention. We should be outraged about what is happening, but we need to be strategic and community-driven in our approach to address these issues. And I think that a lot of what we have to do, unfortunately, is empathy building. And I say unfortunately because it feels like we have to educate upwards, capacity build upwards, but we really have to spend a lot of time. Colonization was pretty good at dehumanizing Aboriginal people. And a lot of those prejudice and biases exist very much in Australian culture and Australian society. So we have to challenge them. Sometimes the anger is counterproductive. So I think we have to be strategic, but it's difficult not to be angry. And sometimes the anger is it's sadness. It's sadness because, here communities are constantly in grief. It seems like sometimes all we're doing is organising vigils and funerals. The anger is sometimes an easier outlet than the sadness and the pain.
Yeah.
So I think it does have its place, as long as we balance it with a need to kind of work towards something together. We do have to be collaborative. And I think that there's a bit of work to be done within the movement about hearing and holding spaces when people are angry because of the pain that's happened to their community, and that all of us have been a part of upholding those systems that continue to perpetuate harm, particularly against Aboriginal women and children. So that we need to take ownership of that, and that we need to push forward and change that using the privileges that we've been granted in this society to try and enact that change. But I don't think that there's a binary between outrage over here and solutions over here.
No.
I think that sometimes the outrage brings attention, and with that attention we can try and push forward and create change. So I don't know if that's a really kind of abstract way of answering that question, but I will also say it's really difficult not to feel outraged sometimes. Like,
it is.
there's a place for it, there's a place for it.
And we've seen it in movements such as the Me Too movement and so on, that the outrage happens, but then where's the transformation that follows? So in the work that we all focus on in human rights and making women's rights human rights, education is considered to be one of the most important parts of getting us closer to either less gender-based violence, more gender equality, and along with the intersectionality that's needed. What are your thoughts here, and what does the transformation rather than reform look like through the lens of education and education in its broadest context?
Yeah, I say transformation because I think all of those systems do need to be transformed. I think we've talked enough about reform, and it's not really good enough. And I think it's because all of those systems are operating exactly as they were intended, which is to create often power over and perpetuate harm, particularly against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So I think we do need a radical transformation. I think education is a pathway to that. But what kind of education? It's got to be both ways. It's got to be that two-way learning. I think often education, people see it through this lens of like, oh, there's this problem over here, so we, as good people are going to go and bequeath our knowledge, and then that's going to fix that problem over there. But actually, often the problem is within the system itself, and is in that whole way of thinking. People are not blank slates that need to be written on. They come with their own knowledge and strength and culture and resilience and all of those things. So I think it's about a sharing. I think it's about an exchange between them. And I think when we talk about education, that system needs to be reformed, definitely in Australia. Because we've got often like a Victorian era kind of education system that's totally not fit for Aboriginal communities often. So I think drawing upon the strengths of both systems and creating something new that works for everybody. But when it comes to ending gender-based violence, then the education piece is definitely a part of that. It's definitely a part so that people understand the scale of it, but also can recognize the signs. I mean, I've experienced that for myself, like not having the language to describe what's happened to you, and then learning that, and it does bring a bit of healing in a way, because now you have the language and the concepts to frame and to communicate what's been happening to you. So I think it's important there in an awareness raising, consciousness raising kind of way. But I think it's also important to educate the people with the power in charge of those systems as well, like our funders, like our governments, like judges and police and healthcare workers, and all of those people who hold respected and powerful positions in our society. And that's because it's up to all of us to end gender-based violence, and a necessary part of that is an incredibly necessary part of that is through the promotion of gender equality. So I think educating about the link between those, I think, is really important, and the evidence around what we know around what works as well.
And none of us can be a bystander, though, can we, Shay? Like this notion, you hear the word of bystander being talked about. I always come from the behaviour you walk past is the behaviour you accept. But where's that bystander? Do we become a bystander, or do we become active? Do we call out every time someone's using the wrong language to describe a woman? Do we call out other men? Do men call out other men? There's a range of things in that broad awareness, advocacy, education isn't there. And there's a lot of work to be done in that space, I would think. Have you got a view?
There is, and I think it's about empowering people with the skills to be able to do that and the confidence to be able to do that. And I think that also requires a reframing, because even with calling out, people hear that and they envision something that's really confrontational. And most people don't want to be involved in confrontation, and particularly men. Men are often afraid of other men as well. So
Yes.
I think what we can do is really talk about the ways that can be done in a healthy and safe way. And sometimes it's not about calling out, but it's about calling in and appealing to the better parts of people's nature, and doing that empathy building and doing that work and strengthening communities, because for sure there are more of us that don't tolerate this behavior than there are those that accept it. I'm convinced of that, whether that's just optimism or not, but I am convinced of that. And I do think that if we stacked everybody up that very much wanted to do something about this problem and cares very much about it, we would definitely have way more people than wants to ignore it. I just think that people often don't know what to do, and also sometimes people are trying to protect themselves as well and doing a great job of that. So I think there can be an education piece, about what you can do and what your role is, because we do all have a role. And I believe very much in the power of behavior change. I believe very much that the harmful behaviors can be changed, and that there is a responsibility to work with all people towards ending this problem, because ending this problem will benefit all of us. And the same with promoting gender equality. That will benefit all of us, but we need to bring everyone along in that conversation, which can be hard sometimes.
Can be. So as we head to wrapping up this conversation today, which is powerful and enlightening, what are your superpowers, and how do these contribute still to the platform you have and navigating barriers?
I don't know. I don't know if I'm not sure if I have any, to be honest. But I think that I can, not always, but I think I can be good at bringing people together. And I think that I've been able to do that many times in movement building and putting things together. So I think that's something that I can do. And I think probably the other superpower that's important in this space is that I'm incredibly stubborn and I don't give up. I persevere.
Yep. And that is often in life the changing force, isn't it? The thing that gets things to happen. So as we wrap, what's the key message you want people to hear today, that you want to leave everyone with?
I think the key message is that gender-based violence is preventable. We know that. We have solutions. We have evidence-based solutions that we know will work, but we have to bring everyone along in that. And I think it's time that we flip our approach so that we're focusing on people who need that attention, the people who need that support, and that they deserve to be leading these responses, not passengers on somebody else's journey, that they should be at the front. And for us in Australia, that has to be Aboriginal women.
Okay, it's been more than a pleasure working with you to have this conversation today. The work you do is so incredibly important in your community and more broadly in our nation as a national voice. I wish you well in continuing to bring people together. And Zonda International, thanks you for your time today.
Thank you.